Hello, family members. I hope you're having a nice day today. Well, I have a lot to talk about, and I want to start with a story. When I first got to chiropractic college in 2004, I was going to Palmer, Florida, which was a new school, and it was very exciting and a lot of excitement on the campus. And I remember I was in a class that was in one of the big lecture halls with maybe like 70, 80 people or something when the topic of vaccination safety came up. And at the time, it was still fairly close to when the whole vaccine autism thing hoax was started. And there was just everybody in the classroom was like, vaccines. And I was the only person in that entire class that was like, vaccines are like one of the best things that humans have ever done. They've saved billions of lives. They're one of the pinnacles of human achievement. Like, what are you guys talking about? This is ridiculous. And I tried really hard to find, something online that I could point to, prove, okay, vaccines have to be pretty darn safe before they're rolled out. And they've been used for decades. And autism is not caused by freaking vaccinations. But I couldn't find anything because it was still such a new topic that there really wasn't the discourse that we have here basically 20 years later. Now, I have a lot of respect for the field of chiropractic. There's a lot of good things that chiropractic does, but as long as people in the chiropractic field are willing to go along with silly stuff like that, the profession's never going to get the respect it deserves. So, anyway, let's talk about the Kennedys. Now, right now, we are dealing with the actions of one specific member of the Kennedy family most acutely, and that is Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., also known as RFK Jr. He is really, really confident about medical stuff. He's a lawyer. Anyway, his father had an older sister named Rosemary was technically her name, but everyone called her Rosemary or Rosie. And it's hard to say whether she was mentally ill or intellectually disabled or a combination of both. You'll see people who assert that she was probably autistic, which may make sense, but we just don't know because her father and her mother lied constantly to try to pretend that she was normal, even though she had showed signs of delay, developmental delay from the time she was an infant. Like, one thing that I read indicated that it's possible she had some brain damage from being born, difficulties during her birth, I guess I should say. The story was just wild. It's on her Wikipedia if you want to read the whole story, but it said that like the nurse forced her mother to keep her legs closed and then Rosemary was stuck in the birth canal for a long time. I don't know how much stock I put in that story, but it just goes to show you that they knew from the very beginning that she was different, and they didn't like that difference. They did everything they could to cover up that difference. And as she grew, she, wasn't like intellectually gifted or anything like that, but she was able to keep a journal, keep a full debutante schedule, which at the time was like ridiculous, all these like teas and dances and things that she had to go to. It seems to me from what I've read that she was accomplished enough to be able to get along in the world. She just was being asked to do things that were beyond her abilities. She had disabilities that everyone in her family refused, not only to refuse to accommodate, but refused to acknowledge. And when she was around 22 years old, she started, acting out. She'd try to sneak away from the convent school they sent her to try to get her out of their faces at night and want to go party. I mean, at 22, can you imagine a 22-year-old wanting to get out and have a little freedom and enjoy herself? How dare she? Let's just lobotomize her. And so they did. They opened up her head, stuck tools inside her brain, forced her to recite things, and fiddled around until her speaking became unintelligible. And then they stopped. They figured that was good. She lost the ability to use the toilet independently. She lost the ability to walk, to talk. And she was immediately hidden away for 20 years until her father was incapacitated and could no longer stop the rest of her family from visiting her and acknowledging her presence. They did not know where she was for 20 years, her siblings, because her father refused to tell them. He never visited her once in 20 years. Her mother never visited her in that entire time, in 20 years. I don't know if you've ever had any family or someone that you care about in a care facility, but I can tell you unequivocally that people who have visitors get better care. And I'm sure everyone at that facility knew that her family wasn't going to come around. So who knows what happened to her. She couldn't tell anyone. In 1961, her father finally was incapacitated to the point where he couldn't keep that control anymore. And this was just a couple of years before her brother was assassinated, or John F. Kennedy. Around this time, she was when RFK Jr. was about 7-8 years old, his family would have finally acknowledged the fact that he had an aunt named Rosemary. He grew up in a family that had been very clear that being intellectually disabled or mentally ill were unacceptable things. Being deviant were unacceptable things. And if you were that, you were some sort of unacceptable person and you had to be dealt with as a problem, hidden away, lied about. I can't imagine that that wouldn't be formative for a 7-year-old, you know? And then a couple of years later, his uncle's assassinated, and then like 5 years after that, his dad's assassinated. This is a man who has failed over and over and done so much harm in with the full intent of doing good. He has done harm. For example, he got a nuclear power plant closed down because he doesn't like nuclear power. And I think that the percentage I read, it was like 37% of the power usage in the state came from carbon, burning fuels the next year. Like, he was trying to do something to help the environment, and instead he did the exact opposite. He made it so that there would be more pollution. Good job, asshole. And if you read his biography, there's just story after story of like this, where he attempts to do something and has the like connections and the name to get himself, like entrenched in some cause, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. And the things that he wants to do aren't helpful. I am just absolutely perplexed why it is that we are letting someone who is this much of an utter repeat failure, a rich man with connections who has only gotten to where he is because of his father's name, which he literally inherited. Do you think that he would get nearly as much attention if he was Timothy Skokel? His cousin, who doesn't have the Kennedy name, but is just as much a Kennedy? Or the Shrivers? Oh, I think I was thinking about Timothy Shriver. What are the Sokels? The Sokels are different. Different branch, same thing. Cousins. You get cousins of the Kennedys who don't get nearly as much attention, but are actually out there doing good for society and trying to leave a positive legacy for their family, for the Kennedy name. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is out there being like, I'm going to save the world, but never takes the time to actually figure out what the world needs. He just decides what he thinks it needs, and then he just goes for it. And that's why his weird crusade to fix autism, he's going to tell us what the cause of autism is by September, which is just ridiculous. Oh, jeez. All right. Here's the thing. Autism is just a different way of thinking, experiencing the world. Some people are neurotypical, some people are neuroatypical. Now, because there are a lot of people who are autistic, there's also going to end up being a certain population that have comorbidities. And I think a lot of times when people have autism and comorbidities, they think that the autism caused the comorbidity, which is not generally true, or maybe never true. So when you see someone who is autistic, who needs a lot of support, has high support needs, just because they're autistic doesn't mean that's why they have those needs. Autistic people are a very important part of society. I mean, one of the things about humans is that we can innovate. We can think of new things. We can find new processes, invent new items, whatever. And being autistic is a very beneficial thing when it comes to seeing the world in a different way. It's not a superpower. It's not better or worse than being neurotypical. I see a lot of autism advocacy out there being like autism is great and autistic people are like lesser. And no, no, that's what they're trying to do to us. We don't need to have them do it. We don't need to do it to them. I don't know that I'm autistic, by the way. I just know that I have been diagnosed with ADD. I have people in my life who think that I probably could try to get an autism diagnosis, but I sure am not trying to get one right now. I'm telling you that. I'm concerned. I'm generally concerned about marking myself in a way that might make me more vulnerable than I already am, which is just not something I'm trying to do right now, There has been such a strong stigma against autism for so long. I had like a relative of a relative, like one of my relatives, in-laws, relatives, so it's like a kind of tenuous connection, who had a child who was obviously autistic. He was a good kid, but he was just obviously autistic. But his mother and father would not allow him to be diagnosed with anything. They wouldn't do anything that would get any sort of diagnosis. And so he was never given supports that he could have used. Now, he grew up and he's fine, but his childhood probably could have been a lot easier for him. And he's probably still, obviously he's still autistic. You don't just stop. Like, it's so weird to me how RFK talks about autism in terms of autism families and children with autism. People who are autistic do not just like poof when they become adults, they still exist, and they're still autistic, and they're still the same people they were when they were kids, just older, And it just goes to show that he is 100% focused on his empathy for parents who have autistic children and how they struggle. And that's just so infuriating because their struggle is secondary to their child's struggle. To try to live in a society that wants to erase your existence, that devalues you, that the freaking, like a guy who's in the U.S. cabinet, who is, I guess, technically in line for the presidency, because that's how that works. Oh no, I just realized that. Oh God. RFK could become president if enough people were assassinated. Okay, nobody assassinate anybody. I mean, I don't want anyone assassinated anytime anyway, but it's extra important right now. Oh gosh. Anyway, but he is completely degrading the existence of all autistic people, man, woman, and child, and in between. And Autistic people have to see that day in and day out. Like, I read this article that was written by a guy who was at the press conference after Kennedy made his like ridiculous statements about people with autism not ever knowing how to use the bathroom alone, which is really not true. Very strange thing to think. And the guy actually is autistic, and he's like, "Hey, I'm autistic. I have a job. I pay taxes. I vote. I can use the bathroom by myself." And Kennedy can look right in that man's face and not see him at all. And just deflect, deflect, deflect. Because in his mind, autism is a childhood illness that is caused by environmental factors. And how awful it is that we don't do everything we can to stop those environmental factors. And whoo boy, that's a thing to think. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you how frustrating I find all this. I was talking to my dad about it earlier today. Now, he was a special ed teacher, and he taught profoundly mentally impaired kids, and a lot of his students did have autism. And so, he knows a lot more about autism than the average person because he's been in that field longer than I've been alive. And he was just like, I can't believe how ignorant that guy is, Like, everything he's saying is just wrong. He also pointed out to me, and I thought that this was interesting. He's like, and he just doesn't have any sense, what to talk about. He talks about like dead animals and his falcon all the time. And I understand because I have a friend who's a falconer. That's pretty a normal thing for falconers to talk about. But it's not a normal thing for the average person to talk about. And he is so wrapped up in his own little world that he can't see that he can't see how much it undermines his credibility not to know how to compartmentalize his hobbies, his, somewhat unusual hobbies from his, public life and his political life. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he's just a horrible person. I mean, he's been described by people that know him as a lifelong adulterer. He left a journal where he confessed to sleeping around on his second wife dozens of times, to the point where she gave the journal to one of her sisters in case something happened to her, and then she was found dead and it was ruled a suicide. There's so many dark corners of this man's past. And yet he feels so empowered to pass judgment on people with intellectual differences. Not even necessarily disabilities, just differences. And I can't help but circle back to the idea of this young child seeing what's going on in his family, seeing how Rosemary was treated, discarded, hidden as a shameful secret. Of course, he's going to be more sympathetic to the family of the person who has the intellectual difference than he is to the actual person. he was never probably given any indication that he needed to look at his aunt as a person. She was always just an object, a burden. By the time that she passed away, she did regain at least a little bit of her functionality. She could walk with a limp, but one of her arms just never worked. I don't think she was ever really able to communicate that well. She lived in, I think, to her 80s. Like 60 years she lived like that. Because, because she was acting like a 22-year-old woman and wanted to have a good time, and her family didn't want her to do that, and they couldn't govern her, and so they literally stuck something in her brain and scrambled her around just to make sure that she wouldn't be a problem anymore. But the joke was on them because she became more of a problem to them. But no matter how bad that impact was on them, it was nothing compared to the 60 years of torment that she endured. The 20 years where she had no contact from anyone in her family because her father refused to let anyone know where she was. And at like 7 or 8 years old, RFK sees that. He sees his grandfather, who he's probably been programmed to think is a great man, had gone to all that effort to hide the shame of his intellectually disabled daughter. I can't help but think that some of his ideology has to go back to that on some level, maybe even subconsciously. During his formative years, it was made extremely clear to him how his family felt about people with disabilities. And I know that later on in life, some of his other aunts and cousins and whatnot actually learned and became better people and actually started the Special Olympics, and which, some of them are still involved in running to this day, which the Special Olympics are a very good organization. I highly recommend looking into them if you have any interest in either volunteering or donating, because they are great. And her Rosemary's sister Eunice said that Special Olympics was not created just because of Rosemary. That shouldn't be just about her. But I can't help but think that their connection to her made it more likely for them to realize that there's these other people in the world that we can be helping too. You don't hang out in disability circles without meeting some really awesome people. And honestly, I think it's a great blessing to have disabled people in your life so that you do get to hang out with disabled people. But, that's just me. RFK is wrong about a lot of things. But he's really, really, really wrong about vaccines. Dr. Andrew Wakefield is the only person who's ever claimed in a scientific paper that there's any link at all between autisms and vaccinations. And his paper was proven to be an absolute fraud. Not just shaky science. Fraud. It was created at a time when he was being paid by lawyers who wanted to sue vaccine manufacturers and needed some sort of connection so they could legally get some sort of payout. It was always about money. It was never about doing what was right for children. It's still not about what's right for children. Measles are insanely contagious. You need to have a measles vaccine if you haven't already. Be up to date on all of your vaccinations. Because things are about to get rougher in this country. And doing everything you can to keep yourself from getting ill is probably one of the best things that you can do, not just for yourself, but for your community. Because one thing that a lot of people forget about vaccinations is that herd immunity is important. For people who are immunocompromised or cannot get vaccinated for whatever reason, like babies, they're too young. In order to protect them, we should all be vaccinated. So that it's less likely that that disease will ever be near them. All right, family members, I could probably go on forever about this. I better stop before the phone cuts me off like it's wont to do. All right, I hope you have a nice day. Oh gosh. Be nice to your friends and family with autism or any sort of disability right now, because we need it. All right, love you. Take care. Bye.